Snow fell in heavy sheets that morning, blanketing the forest like nature's way of silencing everything. The sky was a flat gray, and the wind sliced through the trees like invisible blades. Leander Fitch, a war veteran and longtime deputy in Whitestone County, stepped cautiously across the frozen lake. His thick coat and rugged face couldn't hide the fatigue in his eyes. Beside him walked Rook, a sharp-eyed German shepherd, alert and restless. The air felt off, too still. Then it happened. A sharp cracking sound echoed beneath his boots. The ice gave way instantly. In a blink, Leander vanished into black water. The cold was merciless, wrapping around his body like chains of steel. His breath vanished, stolen by the shock, and panic seized his limbs. He tried to swim, but his gear dragged him down. All around him was dark and soundless. As his lungs screamed for air, flashes of memory, his daughter's voice, letters he never sent, flickered across his mind. The world faded into that quiet, freezing silence. Rook didn't hesitate. The dog barked sharply once, twice, then bolted toward the opening in the ice. He sniffed the air frantically, searching, and then he jumped. The crash into the water was brutal, but Rook powered forward with every ounce of strength he had. He dove beneath the surface, eyes wide, teeth clenched. When he reached Leander, he bit firmly into the collar of his coat and pulled with everything he had. It wasn't just instinct. It was survival, loyalty, love. The surface exploded as Leander came up gasping, eyes wide with terror. Rook braced his front paws on the jagged edge of the ice, pushing upward, his body half submerged, struggling to lift his partner. Around them, more cracks spread like veins across the surface. Time was running out. The weight of their bodies threatened to shatter what little ice remained beneath them. Still, Rook didn't let go. Leander clawed at the edge of the ice, fingers stiff and numb. His muscles trembled, but Rook pulled, growling low, as if commanding him not to give up. Inch by inch, they moved forward, man and dog, locked in a battle with nature. It wasn't just a rescue. It was a bond being reforged in the most brutal conditions imaginable. They weren't safe yet, but something had shifted. Something deeper than ice was breaking. The story isn't over yet, and what's coming next will leave you speechless. So, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell. We're getting close to 100,000 subscribers, and you'll be able to say you were here before the big moment. Leander's body lay half on the ice, half in the frigid water, trembling uncontrollably. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, each one like a dagger in his chest. He could feel nothing in his hands or feet, just a deep ache of cold settling into his bones. Rook stayed by his side, shivering but focused, nudging Leander's shoulder with his nose as if to keep him conscious. The dog's eyes were wide, alert. He seemed to understand. If Leander passed out now, there was no coming back. Slowly, Leander rolled fully onto the ice, coughing up water, his vision blurry. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. His mind fought to stay alert, to assess the situation like he was trained to do. But all he could think about was Rook, how the dog had jumped into a death trap without hesitation. That wasn't training. That was hard. He turned his head weakly and met Rook's eyes. There was no fear in them, only loyalty. And something else, something older, deeper. They were still in the middle of the lake, surrounded by thin ice and biting wind. Leander tried to move, but his muscles protested. Rook walked in a tight circle around him, scanning the woods beyond. The road was too far to call for help. The radio was soaked. Leander had to get moving, or they'd both freeze right there. Gritting his teeth, he pulled himself up slowly, every movement feeling like fire under his skin. Rook pressed close to his leg, almost guiding him. The connection between them had changed, grown as they limped toward the edge of the lake. Snow began to fall harder, blurring the trees ahead. Leander stumbled once, nearly collapsing, but Rook barked sharply, staying close. With each agonizing step, Leander's mind drifted to his wife's funeral 5 years ago. How alone he felt, how silent the house had become after her death. Rook had come into his life shortly after, assigned to him like a tool. But now that dog was more than a partner. He was the only thing keeping him tethered to life. When they finally reached solid ground, Leander collapsed to his knees, gasping. Rook stayed beside him, panting hard, his breath fogging in the frozen air. They were alive, barely. The pain in Leander's limbs was immense, but the pain in his heart was louder. The realization that he'd been drifting for years numbed the world. Until now. The cold had nearly killed him, but what truly scared him was the warmth he'd felt in Rook's eyes. Something was waking up inside him. The warmth of the sheriff's station felt surreal. Leander sat wrapped in 2 blankets, a towel around his shoulders, while a space heater hummed quietly nearby. His fingers still tingled from the cold, his skin blotchy and red. Rook lay at his feet, head resting between his paws, eyes half closed but alert. Every few seconds, Leander glanced down at him, not to check, but to remind himself that the dog was still real, still there, that what had happened out on the lake wasn't some hallucination born of hypothermia. Deputy Mara Jennings stood nearby, arms crossed. "You could have died out there," she said quietly. "You both could have." Leander nodded but didn't speak. The words felt like ice in his throat. Mara didn't press. She'd worked with him long enough to know he wasn't a man who shared easily. But the silence between them now felt heavier than ever. She looked at Rook. "That dog," she muttered, shaking her head. "He didn't just save your life, Leander. He knew what to do, almost like he knew more than he should." Leander stared into the heater's orange glow. Something had been strange. Rook's eyes in the water, the way he locked onto him, the timing, the intensity. It hadn't felt like an instinctual rescue. It had felt like a choice, deliberate, personal. He reached down, resting a hand gently on Rook's head. The dog didn't move, but blinked slowly, as if acknowledging something unspoken. That warmth again, that unsettling sense that there was more behind those eyes than any dog should carry. Later that night, alone in his cabin, Leander dried Rook off for the second time, rubbing him with an old flannel towel. The wood stove crackled beside them. The place was quiet except for the occasional pop of burning pine. Outside, snow continued to fall, muffling the world. Leander sat on the floor, leaning back against the couch, Rook beside him. He felt the ache in his bones. But it was something deeper gnawing at him. A memory had resurfaced, one he hadn't thought about in years. A winter like this, long ago, he had been 10, maybe 11. His brother had fallen through the ice on a different lake. Leander had been frozen on the shore, watching, too scared to move. A neighbor jumped in and saved his brother. But the guilt had never left him. It had stayed buried until the day. But now he had jumped, or rather, Rook had for him. Rook shifted closer, pressing his side against Leander's leg. And in that quiet, it wasn't the cold he feared anymore. It was the weight of a second chance. Morning light spilled through the cabin windows, pale and cold. Leander stood at the kitchen sink, staring out toward the woods behind his property. The snowfall had stopped, but the forest looked different, quieter, somehow older. Rook sat near the back door, ears twitching as if listening to something beyond human hearing. There was a tension in the air that Leander couldn't quite name, but pressed on his chest like unfinished business. His hands trembled slightly as he poured coffee into a chipped mug. He hadn't slept much, not because of the cold, but because of the dreams. In them, he was back under the ice. But this time he was alone. No barking, no rescue, just silence. And in the dreams, it wasn't fear he felt. It was shame. He'd wake drenched in sweat, the image of Rook's eyes haunting him. Those eyes saw too much, more than any animal should. And for the first time in years, Leander found himself questioning his own reality. Was it just trauma, guilt surfacing, or was something else buried beneath that lake? Something that had followed him home? He tried to shake it off. They had work to do. A search team was still combing the edge of the forest, following up on that original call. The voices heard near the lake. That's why he'd gone out there in the first place. But so far, nothing had been found. No footprints, no bodies, just the broken ice and the blood in the snow where Leander had collapsed. It didn't add up. And now there were reports from a nearby farm. Barking at night, strange shadows near the tree line. Leander grabbed his jacket. Something about all of it felt unfinished. Out in the woods, The snow crunched under his boots. Rook led the way, nose close to the ground. They moved deeper into the trees, toward the back ridge. Leander hadn't been out this far in months. Not since before the incident last fall, the one he refused to talk about. As they reached the clearing, Rook suddenly froze. His ears went back. A low growl rumbled in his chest. Leander's hand instinctively went to his holster. Then he heard it, a whisper, not the wind, a voice faint, broken, calling his name. He scanned the trees, pulse racing. Nothing, just a whisper again, like it was inside his own head. He stepped forward, but Rook barked sharply, stepping in front of him, protective, defiant, like whatever was ahead, Leander wasn't ready to face. Not yet. The dog's body was tense, his eyes locked on a shadow between the pines. And in that moment, Leander felt it deep in his chest. That icy thought had melted. It hadn't. It had only cracked, and something was still under there. The forest felt different now, closer somehow. The trees leaned inward like they were listening. Leander stood frozen in the clearing, one hand still resting on Rook's back. The whisper had stopped, but the echo of it lingered in his chest like a memory he couldn't place. Rook's stance didn't soften. The shepherd's eyes stayed locked on the shadows ahead, his growl low and constant. Whatever he sensed, it wasn't an animal. It was something else. Something that made instinct scream louder than logic. Leander took a cautious step forward. "It's okay," he murmured, though he wasn't sure who he was saying it to, Rook himself or that voice that had called his name. But Rook didn't move. Instead, he stood firm, blocking the path, his whole body coiled like a spring. That's when Leander noticed the tracks, just barely visible through the snow, bare human footprints. But they weren't fresh. They were old days, maybe weeks, leading toward the edge of the ridge, then stopping. No return path. No sign of anyone turning back. Just gone. He crouched beside the tracks, brushing away the powdery snow. The ground underneath was scorched, not burnt, not black, but singed in a way that didn't make sense for this cold. He touched it, still warm. That's when Rook barked, a loud, sharp warning. Leander stood and turned fast, hand on his weapon. For a split second, he thought he saw something, a figure, thin, still, just between the trees, watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. Only silence now, but not a peaceful kind. It was the kind that waited. The wind shifted, bringing with a strange smell. Earthy, damp, almost metallic. Leander's mind flashed again to the lake, to the pressure he felt under the ice, the weight of something down there. He'd written it off as fear, as trauma. But now it was rising again in his memory, like something dredging itself from the deep. He didn't know why, but a quiet voice inside him whispered that what nearly killed him in that water hadn't been just nature. Something had watched him drown and chosen not to finish him. He turned to leave, but Rook didn't follow. The dog stood still, tail lowered, staring back toward the tree-line. Leander felt his pulse quicken. Rook had never acted like this, not even in combat zones overseas. It wasn't fear in the dog's posture. It was recognition, like he knew what was out there, like he'd seen it before. And Leander suddenly understood this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about what he was being led to remember. If you were in Leander's boots, would you step deeper into the woods or run? Drop your thoughts below. What do you think Rook saw out there? Eyes! Let's unravel this mystery together. That night, the wind howled against the windows like a warning. Leander sat on the floor again, a blanket draped across his shoulders, while Rook rested near the fire. The dog hadn't eaten. He hadn't slept. Every time the wood cracked in the stove, Rook's ears twitched, eyes snapping to the door. Leander watched him in silence, heart heavy. Something had changed in the woods, and whatever it was, Rook remembered it. But how could that be? Dogs didn't remember like people did. Not in the way Rook was acting. This wasn't just instinct. This was history. Leander stood and crossed the room to his desk. He pulled open the bottom drawer, where he kept things he tried to forget. Old service records, photos, case files from years ago. He hadn't looked through them in ages. As he shuffled through papers, one photograph caught his eye. A group shot from 2011 Afghanistan. Leander in the middle, thinner, younger, and just to his left, a dog, a German shepherd. Same black muzzle, same amber eyes, same scar over the right eyebrow ridge. His heart stopped. He brought the photo closer. The collar was different, but the face, there was no denying it. "Rook," he whispered. The dog looked up slowly, like he'd heard his name call from far away. Leander sank into the chair, the weight of the photo burning in his hand. That dog in the picture, his name had been Axel, part of AK-9 unit lost during an ambush. The report said the dog had died in the explosion. But what if he hadn't? What if someone had taken him, retrained him, reassigned him, renamed him? The thought was insane, but the evidence was right there. That same look, that same instinct, that bond had formed too quickly, too deeply, like they weren't meeting the first time, like they were picking up where something had been violently cut off. And now something had drawn them both back into the woods, into that cold, to remind them. Leander stood and walked back toward the fire. Rook watched him, unmoving. Slowly, Leander knelt and held the photo in front of him. "Is this you?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Rook blinked. Then gently, the dog pressed his nose to photograph, not sniffing, touching, like it meant something, like it hurt. Outside, the wind died down. But inside that cabin, the storm had just begun. And Leander knew the past he thought was buried had found a way back. The next morning, the world looked cleaner after the storm. But inside Leander's cabin, everything felt heavier. The photograph still sat on the coffee table, corners curled, memories now raw and bleeding through time. Leander hadn't spoken to anyone since the night before. What could he even say? That his current K9 partner was the same dog he'd watched disappear in a burning convoy 14 years ago? That somehow, impossibly, Rook, once Axel, had come back to him through smoke, through war, through ice? He looked at the scar on Rook's face again. That small mark had always felt familiar, but now it throbbed with meaning. It wasn't just a physical wound. It was a reminder, a piece of story that neither of them had finished. Rook had changed in the past few days. More alert, more tense, like he was remembering, too. Dogs didn't forget pain, and whatever had happened in between then and now had left a mark deeper than any scar. Leander knew he had to follow the trail, literally and emotionally. He packed light, flashlight, gloves, the photo, and Rook's old military tag he'd found sealed in the envelope of the case file. No one had called it in. No higher-ups had contacted him about the resemblance. That made it even stranger. Was it oversight or deliberate silence? Someone didn't want this part of the past uncovered. And Leander was beginning to suspect that he might have been the reason Rook had been reassigned in the first place. Forgotten like a bad memory. They returned to the ridge that afternoon. Rook led, calmer now, but focused. His paws moved with purpose, as if retracing steps only he could see. The woods were colder here, quieter. The trees seemed older, more brittle. About a mile in, Rook stopped and turned his head toward a fallen birch tree. Then looked back at Leander. That's when Leander saw it. A piece of metal buried beneath the snow. He brushed it off. A military crate, rusted, dented, marked with a faded serial number. His pulse kicked up. He pried it open. Inside, remnants of old gear, burned photos, a name tag half melted. Lieutenant Fitch. His. It was the gear from the truck that exploded, the one where Axel Rook was presumed dead. But someone had collected these things, preserved them, hidden them here for him. Why? Why out here? And why now? He turned to Rook, stunned. But the dog was already staring into the trees again, and something out there was watching them back. Leander stood frozen, the cold seeping through his boots as he stared down at the half-buried crate. His name, melted into that twisted piece of metal, stared back like a ghost. The forest around him had gone still. No wind, no birds, just the crackle of his breath in the air and the steady rhythm of Rook's panting. There was no doubt now. Someone had hidden his box, kept it from the world, and the question burned louder than the cold. Who and why now? Rook let out a low growl, one paw lifted, gaze fixed into the wall of trees ahead. Leander followed his line of sight. First, There was nothing, then movement, subtle, like the shadow of something shifting behind a tree. Not big, but deliberate. A silhouette, human animal, he couldn't tell. But Rook stepped forward, stiff as steel, ears up, tail low, guard mode. Leander reached for his flashlight, flicked it on, and swept the beam through the trees. It landed on a figure, just for a second, standing still in a heavy coat. Hood up, hands down, watching, not moving, and then gone. No footsteps, no rustling, just gone. His heart pounded. The woods felt tighter. He moved slowly toward the spot, Rook close at his side. When they reached the clearing where the figure had been, there was nothing, no prints, no scent, nothing but the faint smell of burnt wood, old, like the smoke of a fire long since died out. Rook circled the space, sniffing the ground, then looked back at Leander, not confused, expectant, as if the dog knew what came next, as if this wasn't just about the past, but about closure, about something unfinished. Back at the crate, Leander sat on a fallen log, trying to steady his hands. He opened the envelope from earlier again. Inside was a second photo he hadn't noticed before, him, Axel, and another soldier, one Leander hadn't thought of in years. Jonas Hale, a communications officer. Quiet, strange, always taking notes. He'd gone missing just days after the ambush. They'd assumed the enemy had taken him. But what if he hadn't been taken? What if he disappeared on purpose and brought the dog with him? Rook rested his head on Leander's knee. The gesture was soft, but his eyes were sharp, still watching the tree lean. Leander knew then Jonas Hale had survived, and he'd taken Axel, hidden him, maybe even reconditioned him. For what purpose, Leander didn't know, but it explained the box, the gear, the strange behavior. Jonas had left a trail, and now all those pieces were leading somewhere deeper into the woods, deeper into memory. Leander stood, brushing snow off his jacket. They weren't done yet, not by a long shot, and whatever waited ahead. Rook was ready to face it with him. The trail was faint, barely more than a memory carved into snow and moss, but Rook followed it with certainty. Leander stayed close behind, the air growing colder with every step. The trees thickened, and with them came a strange stillness, like sound itself refused across this threshold. They were miles from the nearest road, deep in land no one had touched in decades. But Rook walked as if he'd been here before. Maybe he had. Maybe some part of him had never left. Leander's mind raced with questions, but his heart felt heavier than all of them. What had Jonas Hale been doing out here all this time? Why take Axel and vanish into the wild? And why now, after all these years, did everything resurface? The line between memory and present had blurred. Every crack of snow underfoot, every shape in the fog felt familiar, as if the past hadn't passed at all, but waited just out of reach. They came upon a structure, half hidden by trees, an old fire lookout tower, weathered and leaning, forgotten by the world. At its base, the remains of a small camp, rotting crates, animal bones, a burnt-out fire pit, and beside it, a journal bound in leather, half buried under a tarp. Leander picked it up with gloved hands and opened it. The handwriting was unmistakable. Jonas Hale. Pages filled with sketches, notations, and long, rambling thoughts, some coherent, others fractured. Over and over, one phrase repeated across the pages. He remembers. Even when they try to erase it, he remembers. Beneath those words, drawings of a dog's face, the same eyes, the same scar. A sound broke the silence. The creak of a step above. Leander looked up, flashlight in hand. Rook was already staring at the top of the tower, unmoving. A figure stood there, thin, pale, barely more than shadow. Leander raised his voice, careful but steady. "Jonas." The figure didn't respond. Then slowly, it turned and began descending the rusted stairs. The air tightened. Every step sounded like a heartbeat. When Jonas reached the bottom, his face came into the light. Older, gaunt, eyes wide but not afraid. More like relieved. "I knew he'd come back to you," Jonas whispered. They tried to reassign him, reprogram him, but he kept looking, kept remembering. His eyes welled with tears as he looked at Rook. They didn't understand what he was, but I did. Leander didn't speak. He couldn't. The truth was bigger than the cold, bigger than war. Axel Rook had never been just a military tool. He had remembered something no one believed a dog could: love, loyalty, a bond that time and trauma couldn't destroy. Jonas looked at Leander, voice trembling. I saved him from them. But now, he came back to finish what you started. And in that moment, Leander understood what had always been calling him home. They sat in silence for a long time, three figures warmed by nothing but memory. The fire in the old tower's hearth sputtered weakly, but Leander didn't feel the cold anymore. Jonas sat hunched, his face a mixture of exhaustion and peace, as if carrying that secret for so many years had nearly broken him. Rook or Axel lay beside Leander, his head resting on the man's boot. There was no need for words. The truth had already been spoken. The past had bled into the present, and the weight they all carried had finally found ground to rest. Jonas explained in pieces, between coughs and silences. After the ambush, he'd found Axel barely alive, burned, disoriented. The army had classified the dog as expendable, but Jonas had seen something different in him. Even then, he deserted his post, taken Axel, and vanished. I knew they'd try to turn him into something he wasn't, Jonas said, his voice barely more than breath. But he wasn't just a soldier. He was yours. He kept waking in the night, whining, looking for you. Leander swallowed hard, his throat tight. All the years of guilt, of pushing people away, of convincing himself the bond he felt with Rook was just projection. They collapsed under the truth. The dog had come back to him, not because of training, but because of love, that simple, unexplainable force that even death and distance couldn't erase. Axel had remembered through war, through fire, through the ice. He had come home. Jonas's hands shook as he reached for Axel. The dog didn't flinch. He looked at the man, then leaned in gently, touching noses for a brief second. Forgiveness. Then Jonas looked at Leander, eyes glassy. I held on to him all these years, trying to protect him. But maybe I was the one who needed protecting. Leander didn't respond. He simply nodded. Some wounds don't close with words, only with time and letting go. The next morning, as light broke through the trees, they carried Jonas back to town. No one asked questions. The man who had disappeared had finally come back, and that was enough. Later that week, Leander stood beside a simple grave in the woods behind his cabin. Jonas Hale had died peacefully 2 days after returning. Rook had lain beside him all night, guarding him, mourning him. And when the final shovel of earth was placed, Rook didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just stood steady, watching the trees. Leander knelt beside him, hand on his fur. You're home now, he whispered. But deep down, he finally understood. Home wasn't a cabin, or a uniform, or a place. Home was Rook, and Rook had never truly left. If the story moved you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more real and emotional stories like this one. Share it with someone who loves animals and believes in the deep bond between humans and dogs. Your support means the world to us.